So we have like, let's call it a baseline cycle. And unfortunately, I don't know the name. So maybe you can find it and put it in a like little subtext. I've forgotten the name, but it's the basic cycle of, denial and acceptance and bargaining and all that stuff. And this seems to be just a
I think
natural.
that's the Kubler-Ross stages of grief.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. So there we go. So the Kubler-Ross stages of grief seems to be a part of just psychology. And frankly, there's probably really good reasons for it. It's been selected for over long periods of time in lots of different contexts. And think of that as like the natural thing. So no matter what, when you run into something that's going to hit you with a big shift in change, you will go through that. So don't fight it, swim with it. Right? So when you're feeling really depressed by the realization that things are much worse than you thought, in some sense, if you can be metacognitively aware of the fact that you're in the right place and just kind of allow yourself to process that in the way it needs to be processed, so you can get into the other side of acceptance as smoothly as possible, not as quickly. You can't make it go faster than you can. Then you're doing as well as you can. Right? And I want to put a particular note. I've noticed in myself at least four of these cycles. The last one was 2 days ago at 3 a.m. So something's going on right now where the rate of change and the magnitude of change and the quality of change is such that acceptance, which is to say to begin to step into building an adaptive response to what is, actually finds itself yet again overwhelmed by a change of what is that is big enough in magnitude to require that you actually go through a whole new cycle. So that's kind of like an unfortunately powerful part of what's happening. But then we actually have a different dynamic, and this is the dynamic of addiction, which has to do mostly with denial. So this is a breakdown of our sense-making and choice-making system where reality hits us. And I think it's actually not, it's this Kubler-Ross system, but a particular subset of what happens. It's a reciprocal closing of Vervaeke, as Vervaeke describes it. So reality hits us, and we kind of have a choice. We can either deal with this cycle, deal with the unpleasantness of this cycle and the necessity of actually changing our behavior, or we can bullshit ourselves. Right? And we have that choice. And if we happen to have, in some sense, the privilege, the benefit of being able to bullshit ourselves and not have reality really kick us in the teeth, it's all too easy to bullshit ourselves. And if the magnitude of change that we have to go through in the context of reality feels uncomfortable enough, right? So we get this kind of separation. This is why, by the way, addiction can really, really hammer the wealthy, because money allows you to buy not changing a lot easier. You don't hit rock bottom as painfully, which is kind of an odd thing. Like oftentimes people who don't have resources get, it gets really bad because they do hit rock bottom. But the amount of sort of what gets pulled with them in duration in life may in fact be shorter cycle. They hit rock bottom in years as opposed to in decades. But in any event, as a culture, this is particularly the case. So in the West, the massive plenitude that we've been able to produce over the last 50 years, 70 years, has given us the ability to sort of kick the can down the road, to go into bullshitting ourselves and avoiding the uncomfortable reality of the necessity of changing what are in fact rather significant pieces of our behavior and our infrastructure and our institutions. And by the way, stepping into a lot of uncertainty. Change requires actually stepping away from certainty into uncertainty, and that by itself is uncomfortable. And of course, if you do that, if you bullshit yourself, reality, well, sometimes reality just goes away. Sometimes it actually works out. Sometimes the thing that you were trying to avoid thinking about actually does go away. And you can, yeah, I got away with it, which by the way, reinforces the behavior. But generally speaking, it doesn't. Generally speaking, reality is reality. It doesn't really care how much you bullshit yourself. In fact, generally speaking, if you bullshit yourself, you do make matters worse. So, the next day, reality comes knocking at the door and says, hey, it's time to change. Something just went wrong. Again, you're faced with a choice, but now you're kind of deeper in, because the magnitude of your bullshit, the delusional story that you begin telling yourself, and the self denial and the narratives that you constructed to enable your bullshit, have a bigger control over where you are, and you have to actually go through you have to feel all the discomfort that you've been delaying at once. So instead of being discomfort of one, now it's discomfort of three. So you have a choice. Do you go deeper into the rabbit hole and bullshit yourself even further? Or do you suck it up and go through the even bigger magnitude of change you have to go through? Generally speaking, people will often choose the first path. And again, if you can get away with it, if you can throw more bullshit, let's just use like the financial system as a very concrete example. In 2008, reality hit us and said, you guys have been really fucking this up for a long time. The global financial system is not functional. It's hyper fragile. It's optimized for efficiency. It's making bad choices, bad resource allocation. Got to change this in a big way. Big banks got to go. Probably even centralized banks as a mechanism have got to go, this whole structure. And our global collective intelligence governance system said, oh, that sounds really painful. Nope. You know, I'd like to take a double shot of heroin and amphetamines. Did we get a big shot of heroin and amphetamines? Well, yes, we can. Okay, good. Let's do that instead. And of course, over a period of time, it was like, well, that amphetamines wasn't enough. We need a lot more.
Which is like putting a load of money, quantitative easing, just basically printing money.
Right. Yeah. Let's cut interest rates a quarter point. Well, that didn't work. Okay, let's cut it half a point. That didn't work. Let's go to 0 interest rates. Well, that's not working anymore. Let's go to negative interest rates. It's that kind of that cycle. And the point of that stage is that each one of those decision points was a decision point where you could decide either to bullshit yourself more or suck it up and actually go through the change necessary to get to actual sobriety. And so at the level of the financial system, like reality had percolated through, the crisis had kind of come enough to an end that by the time that we were sitting around 2014, 2015, 2016, and our capacity for producing stimulants was strong enough that we went through a felt sense of another high. But it wasn't a real thing. Right? The underlying damage was pretty heavy. It's a little bit like you can imagine that you were running a race and you like fell and sprained your ankle really badly. But you just decided to wrap it up with some tape and then inject yourself with a combination of painkillers and stimulants, and just went back running on the ankle. Well, when you're under the influence of the painkillers and the stimulants, and the wrap is kind of good enough, you might actually be running pretty well, but you're doing damage to the ankle. And when the stimulants and the painkillers wear off, you're now even worse than you were before. So that's what's happening right now in the financial system. The magnitude of what's being done right now in the US, and this is going to cascade globally, of course, is like a whole step up from everything that happened in the period between 2008 and 2012. Like it's like 2 or 3 times X already, and we're only 4 or 5 days in. Which is to say that we're just continuing to choose to bullshit ourselves. The addict is continuing to choose to update the delusional story. Whatever you do, don't pay attention to what's real. And doubling down on the stimulant, the thing that allows the system to continue to operate as if reality isn't what it is. And eventually, as every addict knows, you hit rock bottom. And you always have a choice when you hit rock bottom. You have a moment of clarity. And the moment of clarity, you can finally choose to just get into complete acceptance. And by the way, oftentimes I believe the story is to submit to a higher power, to surrender, and begin to say, okay, I really don't know how to deal with this. I need to actually begin learning from the beginning again, and realize I got to take my lumps. I actually have to grow through the change that has to happen to get to sobriety and ultimately to health. Or you can go right back down to the denial cycle until ultimately death, right? And I think that's a really good conceptual model. As we've done, we've kind of been moving back and forth between the individual human biological example and the financial example. And by the way, if you'd like, you can transpose this to the political side, for example.
But what would it look like if this is denial, what would it actually look like to face reality, and what would the changes need to be?
I mean, okay.
just a list rather than maybe going into kind of, yeah.
Yeah, this is something that I've been looking at for now, again, about 15 years. So it's actually not that, in some sense, not that mysterious. I've already laid out most of it.
Yeah.
The first is to accept you got a problem. Let's do AA. Like the fucking AA guys have got it kind of wired. First, accept you've got a problem. Like stop denying that you've got a problem. Second, begin the process of coming into awareness and relationship with the reality of the problem. Like begin the process of actually stepping into reality. So in this case, for example, I would propose that it would be quite helpful to have a collective conscious acceptance of the reality of the meta crisis that I've been talking about. That the thing in front of us, the acute crisis, is a symptom of a much larger chronic crisis that has been ongoing for a long period of time. And to reach a level of acceptance of the magnitude of change, and in some sense, at least the qualities of change that need to occur. For example, if I'm a baby boomer who has been holding on to the reins of power of particular institutional structures for a long time, I think it's time to acknowledge the generational transfer is an actual necessity. I think it's time to acknowledge that the reality is that I don't really know what to do. And that's okay. It's not my job to know what to do. There are other people who are younger than me that have grown up in completely different environments, that have better instincts and better learnings about the reality that we currently live in. It's their job to know what to do. Now, I may actually have a deeper connection to why, if I've lived life well and full and thoroughly, that I actually have developed embodied wisdom, and I can start trying to present why. And this notion of we, who we might be, like the deep tradition is still carried in my body in the way that younger people can't have. But the specific strategy and response that we ought to be engaging in, okay boomer, is a archetypal and practical sign of the reality of that case. You're fucking out of the loop. You don't really understand what's going on in reality, and yet you're still clutching on to the reins of power with my cold, dead hands. That's just one example. I don't mean to harsh on that. That's just a very specific example. 2, if you happen to be in charge of a very large, powerful institution, it's time to recognize that institution probably needs to die. Sorry, too big to fail banks. The right response is you actually need to go away. That's just the reality. And I understand this is not an easy thing to do. It will be challenging. But doing it consciously, intentionally, and deliberately, rather than with our hand forced by crisis coming from 15 different directions, and by the way, now geopolitical movement of other people realizing that weakness and crisis is an opportunity to take advantage of things, is just a better idea. So if we had back in 2008 recognized that the response to too big to fail banks was no longer too big to fail banks in the world, we would be massively better off now. So that's another example. And by the way, education. Want to pick another poison? The global education system, particularly the American education system. The right response right now is to recognize that it's just a fucking mess, top to bottom. And this is not a matter of trying to tinker around the edges with different testing methodologies. It really is a time to say, okay, wow, I've actually got every American school child is no longer in school, and possibly for the next 6 months. Now's the time to really think about hitting a reboot on the whole thing. And can we rapidly pull together an entirely different approach to education? And here's the thing, again, if you're running the education system, you don't know what the fuck to do. You've been focused on trying to figure out how to maintain the patient for so long that you maybe have real amazing expertise in maintaining the patient. But by definition, that means you haven't been spending a lot of time in yourself working on the way that you think about things and how to respond to new possibilities. But there are other people who have been. I think Samo Bergia actually put it, I think, very precisely. The only appropriate response right now is hand the keys over to people who are both smart and brave.